The lawyer's name was Diane Foster, and she almost didn't turn to page 2. That's the part that still gets me, and I wasn't even there to see it. She had a closing to run. 11 o'clock, conference room on the second floor of a title company off the highway. My son Dale sitting on one side of the table in his good jacket, the buyer sitting on the other side with his own lawyer and his own checkbook, and my granddaughter Callie standing by the window because nobody had thought to pull out a chair for her. The farm had been in escrow for 6 days. 6 days. I hadn't even had my funeral yet. Diane Foster had the title report open in front of her, the kind of document most people skim because it's 40 pages of legal boilerplate nobody reads twice. She told the room she just needed 2 minutes to confirm the chain of title was clean before anybody signed anything. Dale told her to make it quick. They had a check waiting. She said she always did, the way anyone says a thing they've said 1,000 times before without expecting this particular Tuesday to be any different from the rest. And then she turned to page 2, and she stopped turning, and the room, Callie told me later, went quiet in a way rooms only go quiet when something has shifted that nobody there has language for yet. I wasn't there to see her face, but my lawyer was, because I'd asked him to be, and he told me well, he told Callie, and Callie told me in the only way she still could, which was standing at a graveside 3 weeks later and talking to a headstone like I could hear her. Which, in the way that matters, I could, because I'd already heard everything. I'd written it that way. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense yet, and I promised myself if I was ever going to tell this story, I'd tell it right. My name is Warren Coyle. I farmed 410 acres in the same county my father farmed, and his father before him, wheat and soybeans and a stand of black walnut trees my great-grandfather planted for a barn he never lived to build. I was 76 years old when the doctor sat me down and told me I had maybe 8 months. And I want you to understand something before you go any further with me. Everything that happened after that sentence, I planned. The lawyer, the deed, the timing, all of it. I am telling you this story from the other side of my own funeral, and the only reason I can is because I made sure, before I went, that I'd still have the last word. I should tell you about the good in my son, because he wasn't a villain the day he was born, and it does neither of us any favors to pretend he was. Dale was a hard worker as a boy. He was up with me at 5 most mornings before school without complaint, and there's a photograph somewhere of him at 9 years old, asleep sitting up in the combine cab because he'd refused to go inside until the wheat was in. He had that in him. He had my father's stubbornness and, for a long while, my father's patience, too. I loved him without qualification for 40 years before any of this started, and loving him without qualification is exactly why what came later cut as deep as it did. You don't get betrayed by strangers. You only get betrayed by people you built a life around. My wife Ruth Ann died 11 years before any of this, cancer. Same as what eventually came for me, which is either a cruel joke or just how farms and bodies both wear out if you use them long enough. After she passed, it was just me and the land, and 3 years on, Callie, my granddaughter, Dale's daughter, who'd come out most weekends from the community college 40 minutes away because, in her words, the dorm food was terrible and my coffee was worse, but at least I let her talk. She was the one who still called the farm ours instead of his. She was the one who knew which fence line the deer came through and which walnut tree my great-grandfather is buried under, informally, because that's where we scattered him. I remember one Saturday, not long before any of this started, when a stretch of the south fence came down in a storm and Callie drove out unannounced with work gloves already in her truck, because she said she'd figured I'd need an extra pair of hands and hadn't wanted to wait for me to ask. We spent 4 hours restringing wire in the mud, barely talking, the good kind of quiet two people share when neither one needs the other to fill it. I thought about that afternoon a great deal in the months that followed. It was the kind of ordinary thing nobody would ever think to put in a will, and yet It was the entire reason I eventually did what I did. Everybody in that family had a role. Dale managed the money end from town, where he'd moved 15 years back to sell insurance. His wife Brenda managed Dale. And I managed 410 acres alone at 76, because nobody had offered to help in longer than I cared to count. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday in January. Stage 4, pancreatic. The doctor's voice doing that careful thing doctors do when they've delivered this news enough times to know exactly how much hope to leave in the room. 8 months, if I was fortunate. I drove home from that appointment with the radio off, and somewhere around mile marker 11 I made a decision that had nothing to do with dying and everything to do with what would happen the week after I did. I decided I was not going to let anyone find out I was sick. Not yet. Not until I understood exactly what kind of people my son and his wife had become when they thought nobody who mattered was watching. I sat with that decision for 3 days before I trusted it. It's a strange thing, deciding to keep your own death a secret from the people who love you, and I want to be honest that it didn't feel noble while I was doing it. It felt, more than anything, like laying a trap in my own house, and there were nights I lay awake wondering if that made me as calculating as the very thing I was afraid Dale and Brenda might turn out to be. What settled it for me, in the end, was a simple test I gave myself. I wasn't trying to catch anyone doing something wrong. I was trying to see, honestly and without warning them to perform otherwise, who my family actually was when they thought no clock was running out on my life yet. If I was wrong about them, the silence would cost nothing. If I was right, I needed to know before it was too late to do anything about it. I found out inside of 6 weeks. The first thing was small enough that I almost let it go, which is exactly how these things get their foot in the door. I mentioned to Dale on the phone that the tractor needed a new hydraulic pump, $1,100, and could he help me carry it until harvest paid it back. There was a pause on the line I didn't like the sound of. Then he said, and I remember this word for word because it landed strange in my chest, "Dad, at your age, is it even worth sinking more money into that place?" Not let me help you. Not we'll figure it out. A question about whether the farm itself was still worth the investment, asked to my face. 6 weeks after I'd started carrying a diagnosis I hadn't told him about. I paid for the pump myself. I didn't bring it up again. I didn't know it yet. But it wasn't going to be the last time that spring I'd hear my own life priced out loud in front of me. The second thing came a month later, and this one I didn't get secondhand. I was standing right there. Brenda had driven out with Dale for Sunday dinner, and somewhere between the pot roast and the pie, she started talking, casual as anything, about a listing she'd seen for a subdivision going up 2 counties over. Nice homes, she said. Good schools. Then she looked around my kitchen, the one Ruth Ann had picked the cabinets for in 1987, and said it was a shame a piece of land this size was just sitting here depreciating instead of being put to its highest use. I asked her what she thought its highest use was. She smiled and said, "Well, eventually, Warren, everything becomes somebody's inheritance." She wasn't wrong that it would be an inheritance. She was wrong about whose, and wrong about when she thought she'd get to start planning for it. I said nothing. Callie, sitting across from me, went very quiet and didn't touch her pie. The third thing was the one that told me everything I needed to know, and I didn't get it from a conversation at all. I got it from a stake in the ground. I came home from a follow-up scan in early April, a scan Dale didn't know I'd had, and found 6 orange surveyor's flags planted in a straight line through my north field, the same field I checked every Monday of my working life. I called the surveying company before I called my son. The dispatcher told me cheerfully that a Mr. Dale Coyle had scheduled a boundary survey the week prior, described as routine for insurance purposes. I have farmed long enough to know what a boundary survey costs, and I have lived long enough to know nobody pays that price for insurance. Those flags were subdivision lot lines. Somebody had already started drawing streets through my bean field, and it wasn't going to be me. I didn't confront him about it. Not yet. I let the flags stand exactly where they were, and 4 days later, at my own 77th birthday dinner, Dale stood up with a glass in his hand to say a few words, the way he always did. On each table, as a keepsake, he'd had little printed cards made up a nice touch, Brenda called it, something for everyone to take home. I picked mine up while he was still talking. It read, in tasteful script, growing forward, together. I recognized the phrase before I understood why. It was the same line, word for word, off a folded developer's site plan brochure I'd glimpsed once in Brenda's tote bag weeks earlier, the one advertising homes on land not yet zoned for them. My son had turned a subdivision's marketing slogan into a party favor for my birthday and hadn't noticed, or hadn't cared, that the two things were the same sentence. He raised his glass, talked for 2 full minutes about moving the family forward, and in all of it, at a table set in the house his mother had built her whole married life around, he did not say Ruth Ann's name once. That was the breaking point, though nobody at that table would have known it to look at me. I sat with my hands folded, and I smiled, and I said thank you when it was over, and inside I felt something close, quiet, and final, like a barn door swinging shut on its own weight. I understood, sitting there with cake in front of me I didn't want, that my son had already started grieving my farm as an asset while I was still very much alive to hear him do it. Later that night, alone in the kitchen doing dishes nobody had offered to help with, I found myself talking out loud to Ruth Ann the way I still did sometimes when the house got too quiet, asking her, half joking, whether I was losing my mind or whether our son really had just given a toast about legacy without once saying her name. I didn't get an answer, obviously, but saying it out loud to an empty kitchen was the moment I stopped wondering whether I was imagining the pattern and started treating it as a fact I needed to act on. I understood that if I told them I was dying, the countdown wouldn't be about me at all. It would be about the calendar until closing. I didn't rage. I want to be clear about that, because I think people expect the man in these stories to slam a door or shout across a dinner table, and that was never going to be me. Ruth Ann used to say I got quieter the angrier I was, and by the time I was truly furious, I went nearly silent, which she said was worse than shouting because you couldn't tell what I'd decided until it was already done. That's exactly what happened here. I finished my cake. I thanked everyone for coming. And on Monday morning, instead of going out to check the North Field like I did every Monday of my life, I called a lawyer 2 towns over, a woman named Patricia Boyle, who'd handled a boundary dispute for a neighbor of mine years back and had struck me, even then, as someone who read every line of a document before she'd let a client sign it. Her office was above a hardware store, small, a single window looking out over the courthouse square, and I remember she had a jar of peppermints on her desk that she never once offered me, which for some reason made me trust her more. Not less she wasn't performing warmth, she was just doing her job carefully. I told Patricia everything. The diagnosis, the pump, the subdivision comment, the toast. She listened without interrupting, which is rarer in a lawyer than you'd think, and when I was done she asked me one question. What did I actually want to happen to the farm? Not what I wanted to say to Dale, not what I wanted him to feel. What I wanted to happen to 410 acres of black walnut and wheat ground after I was no longer around to farm it. I told her I wanted it to go to Callie. Not split, not shared. Not for the family in the way Dale used that phrase, like a coin he could spend however he liked. Callie, specifically, because she was the only one who'd ever called it ours and meant the same thing by it that I did. Here's what Patricia explained to me, and I'm going to walk through it slowly, because this is the part of the story that actually matters, and I don't want to rush past it the way people rush past the fine print on anything. A will, she told me, is a promise about what happens after you die, and promises like that go through probate, a court process, public, slow, and exactly the kind of thing a family in a hurry can maneuver around if they decide not to wait for it. But a deed, she said, is not a promise. A deed is an action. It happens the moment you sign it and record it at the courthouse, while you are still very much alive, and it cannot be undone by anyone waiting around for you to die. What she proposed was called a life estate deed. I would deed the farm to Callie outright, right then, that spring, months before I ever expected to need it, but I would retain what's called a life estate for myself. That meant I could go on living there, farming it, doing exactly what I'd always done, for as long as I was alive. Callie would hold what's called the remainder interest. And the moment I died, Patricia told me the property would pass to her automatically, immediately, completely outside of probate, because it was never mine to leave in a will in the first place. It would already be hers. It had been hers since the spring I signed it. Think of it like a gift you wrap and hand over now, she told me, except the ribbon doesn't come off until you're gone. Nobody can take back a gift that's already been given. They can only fight over one that's still sitting in the box. That was the plain version, and I turned it over in my head the whole drive home, because it was the first sentence in months that had made the whole tangle make sense. I wasn't leaving Callie a farm in my will. I was giving her the farm. Now today, I would simply be the last one allowed to live on it. We recorded the deed in the last week of April, filed with the county clerk in the same brick courthouse where my father had recorded his own deed 60 years before, and where his father had recorded his before that. I drove home afterward and did the one thing I always did when something mattered enough to remember properly. I took down the farm ledger. It's a leather book, cracked soft at the spine now, that my great-grandfather started the year he planted the walnut trees, and every Coyle who worked this ground after him added to it in the same slanted hand-planting dates, weather that ruined a crop, the year the well ran dry, the day Ruth Ann and I were married written in my father's writing, because he'd been the one holding the pen that week while I was too nervous to trust my own. I opened to the next blank page, and I wrote, in my own hand, the date, and beneath it, deed recorded. Remainder to C. Coyle, life estate reserved. She doesn't know yet. Then I closed the book and put it back on the shelf where it had sat my entire life, and I went out and checked the north field, same as any other Monday. Nobody in my family knew what I'd just done. It would be 6 more months before anyone found out, and by then it would be far too late to matter. I want to stop here and tell you something I only understood fully as I sat writing that line, because I think it's the part of this whole story that changed something in me permanently. I had spent months being hurt by what Dale and Brenda said, turning their words over at night like stones I couldn't stop picking up. But sitting there with the pen in my hand, I realized the hurt had never actually been about the money, or the subdivision, or even the toast. It was that I had spent my whole life assuming legacy meant the land staying in the family's name. And what I finally understood, writing that entry, was that legacy was never the acres. It was who still knew what the walnut trees were for. Dale had forgotten. Callie hadn't. The deed wasn't punishment. It was just the truth, finally written down in ink instead of left to be argued over. I told no one. Not Dale, not Brenda, not even Callie, though she was the one it was all for. Patricia asked me once, gently, whether I wanted to tell my granddaughter what I'd done, and I said no, not yet, because if she knew, she'd feel it, and I didn't want her carrying the weight of a secret that heavy on top of everything else that was coming. I wanted her to find out the way you find out something is load-bearing only when the wall around it falls away and it's still standing. I lived on the next 2 months exactly the way I always had, through the last of planting season and into the start of summer. I never told Dale about the diagnosis until I had no choice, which turned out to be late June, when I collapsed loading feed and Callie found me and called the ambulance herself. After that, there was no more hiding it. Dale came out more often. So did Brenda, though her visits had a different texture to them, quieter, more attentive. The kind of attentive that made Patricia, who I told everything, ask me once whether I thought it was concern or inventory. I didn't answer her. I didn't need to. I'd already recorded the only answer that mattered months before, in a courthouse neither of them had thought to check. I died on a Thursday in October, 9 months after the diagnosis, a month past even what the doctor had called the best I could reasonably hope for. I remember thinking, in whatever half-clear way you think about anything near the end, that I'd at least managed to outlast my own good luck. Callie was in the room. Dale was in the hallway on a call. I'd like to tell you I heard something profound in my last hours. Some sentence that tied the whole thing up. But mostly I remember being tired and grateful and thinking about wheat. What happened next, I only know the way you know a room you've left through the people who were still standing in it. Callie told Patricia. Patricia told her attorney friend, who mentioned it once at a bar association dinner to a young title agent named Diane Foster, and that thread, thin as it was, ended up mattering more than anyone could have guessed at the time. But the part that matters most, the part I need you to sit with, is what Dale did in the 6 days between my death and my funeral. He called a real estate agent on the 2nd day, not the 8th day, not after the service, not after so much as a decent breath of mourning the 2nd day, while my body was still at the funeral home and the obituary hadn't even run in the county paper yet. He told the agent the farm needed to move fast, that there was a window, that a developer 2 counties over had already expressed interest in the acreage for exactly the subdivision Brenda had mentioned at that Sunday dinner more than a year before. By the 4th day, they had a buyer. By the 5th day, they had a contract, drafted and signed by Dale as what he believed, in good faith or something close enough to it, was the sole heir and executor of my estate. The closing was scheduled for the morning of day 6. My funeral was scheduled for day 9. I want to be fair to Dale here, because even now, even after everything, I don't think he set out to sell his father's grave before it was dug out of malice exactly. I think he'd spent a year quietly deciding the farm was a liability dressed up as sentiment, and once I was gone, that decision simply executed itself the way decisions do when nobody's left to argue the other side. Brenda, though Brenda's driving beat in this story, is a little less complicated. It was Brenda who called the agent's office a 2nd time on day 3 to ask if the closing could be moved up, because, in her words on the voicemail Callie later heard by accident, the sooner it's done, the less anyone has time to make it weird. She used the word weird to describe grief. I think that tells you plenty about the kind of inventory she'd been quietly taking on those visits out to see me. Callie found out about the contract on day 5, the day before closing, when Dale mentioned it to her almost in passing, asking if she wanted to come by the farmhouse before the new owners took possession to pick out anything of Grandpa's she wanted to keep. She has told me since well. She has told the version of me that lives in this story, which is the only version left to tell it to, that she stood in her kitchen holding the phone and felt something crack open in her chest that had nothing to do with the sale, and everything to do with how easily her father had said the word possession about a house I'd died in 5 days. Earlier, she didn't argue with him. She didn't need to. She called Patricia instead, the way I'd told her to if anything about the farm ever felt wrong before she understood why. Patricia told her, calmly, the thing I'd asked her to say exactly this way if the moment ever came, that Callie didn't need to stop the sale, because the sale had already stopped itself 6 months earlier, in April, in a courthouse, in a deed neither Dale nor Brenda had ever thought to look for, because neither of them had ever once in their whole adult lives gone down to that courthouse and pulled the actual chain of title on the farm they assumed was theirs to sell. Patricia told her one more thing. She told her not to call Dale, not to warn him, not to say a word. Let the title company find it, she said. That's what title companies are for. Your grandfather already did the hard part. All that's left is for someone to turn the page. That's the part of this that still catches in my chest, wherever this part of me is now, telling it to you. I wasn't in that conference room. I couldn't be. But I built the room months before I ever expected to need it, And I want you to understand that everything that happened next, every second of it, happened because of a decision I made while I was still very much alive and furious in the quietest way I knew how to be. That's what I mean when I tell you the dead don't get the last word by accident. I earned mine in April. Dale just didn't find that out until October. The morning of the closing, Callie went. Nobody had invited her, exactly, but nobody had told her not to come either, and she has told me since that she sat by the window because there wasn't a chair pulled out for her, and because, frankly, she didn't want one from that table. She brought the ledger with her, not to show anyone. Just because it felt wrong, she said, to let the farm's whole life get decided in a room without at least one book that remembered what the farm actually was. Diane Foster arrived at 11 with the title report in a blue folder, 40-some pages, the kind of document that exists specifically so that people don't have to think too hard about whether a sale is actually legal before they sign it. She'd told Dale's agent on the phone the day before that this was a routine title search. Standard for any sale, nothing to worry about, 4 to 6 business days typically, though they'd rushed it in 3 at Dale's request because of the window he kept mentioning. She sat down, opened the folder, and told the room she needed 2 minutes. Page 1 was the legal description of the property, boundary lines, acreage, the kind of language that reads the same on every deed in the county. Dale barely glanced at her while she read it. He was checking his watch. The buyer's agent was already sliding a pen across the table toward him. Uncapped, ready, Diane Foster turned to page 2. She went quiet in a way that made Dale look up from his watch. She read it once. Then she did something odd. She went back to page 1, checked the recording date stamped in the corner, and then returned to page 2 and read it again. Slower, the way you reread a sentence you assume you must have misunderstood the first time. "Mr. Coyle," she said, "I'm going to need to pause this closing." Dale said there was no reason to pause anything, that the property was his father's estate, that probate was a formality they'd already begun, that the family had every right to sell. Diane Foster set the folder down flat on the table so he could see it himself, and she turned it around to face him. "This is a recorded life estate deed," she said, "filed with the county this past April. It grants the remainder interest in this property in full to a Callie Marie Coyle. Your father retained a life estate for himself, which means he retained the right to live on and use the property for the duration of his life. But the ownership, the actual title, transferred to your daughter the day this was recorded. 6 months ago." She let that sit for a moment before she said the rest. "Your father's death didn't give this property to his estate, Mr. Coyle. It removed the only obstacle standing between your daughter and full ownership. As of the day he passed, this farm has belonged entirely and solely to her." The room did the thing rooms do when a sentence lands that nobody in it was prepared for. The buyer's agent stopped sliding the pen. Brenda, who Callie said had been checking her phone under the table the whole meeting, looked up sharply enough that her chair scraped the floor. And Dale, the boy who'd once refused to leave a combine cab until the wheat was in, who I'd raised to believe a handshake and a deed meant the same thing, said the only thing he could think to say, which was, "That's not possible." He never mentioned any of this. Diane Foster's answer to that was the plainest sentence anyone said in that entire room, and Callie has repeated it to me to this version of me more than once since, because she said it was the moment she finally understood what her grandfather had actually built. "Recorded deeds don't require mentioning, Mr. Coyle," Diane said. "That's the entire point of recording them. They're a matter of public record specifically so that nobody has to take anyone's word for anything. Your father didn't need to tell you. He needed the courthouse to know. It did." Dale turned to Callie, and for the first time in the whole meeting, he actually looked at her instead of past her. "Did you know about this?" he asked, and she told him the truth, because there was nothing left to protect by lying. "No," she said. "I found out the same way you just did." Which was true, and which was, I think, the cruelest kindness I ever built into this whole plan, that neither of them would learn it from the other. They'd both learn it from a stranger with a folder at the same moment in the same room, so that neither one could ever accuse the other of hiding it. The closing did not proceed. It could not. Diane Foster's firm would not issue title insurance on a property the sellers didn't actually own, and no bank was going to fund a purchase that couldn't be insured. The buyer's own lawyer actually laughed once, briefly, the short involuntary laugh of a man who has just watched a deal die in front of him for a reason he's never once seen in 15 years of closings. The buyer himself, a quiet man who'd said almost nothing through the whole meeting, simply stood up, buttoned his jacket, and told the room he hoped they got it sorted out. Because from where he was sitting it looked like the kind of family matter that had no business being settled at a closing table in the first place. He shook Diane Foster's hand on his way out and didn't shake anyone else's. Dale sat very still. Brenda did not. "This is insane," Brenda said. "He can't just give away a farm without telling anybody." Diane Foster looked at her the way you look at someone explaining a law of physics to a person insisting it doesn't apply to them personally. "He can," she said. And he did. 6 months ago. Nobody in that room said much for a long moment after Brenda's outburst. Diane Foster simply closed the blue folder, gathered her things, and told Dale's agent she'd need instructions in writing before she could release any further documents, which is the kind of sentence that ends a closing more thoroughly than any argument could have. Callie left before anyone else did. She didn't want to watch what came next in that room, the buyer's agent gathering papers, Dale on his phone to his own lawyer, Brenda's voice climbing into the register she used when she wanted a room to feel the size of her anger. Callie drove straight to the farmhouse instead, let herself in the back door the way she'd done 1,000 times, and sat down at the kitchen table where Ruth Ann had picked the cabinets in 1987. The ledger was still in her bag from that morning. She took it out, and for the first time since she'd packed it that day, almost as an afterthought, she actually opened it. She read backward through generations of handwriting she barely recognized, a well-running dry in 1974, a wedding recorded in careful cursive, a note about the year the walnut trees finally came into full yield. And then she reached the last page anyone had written on, dated the second Thursday in April, in handwriting she knew instantly because she'd seen it on every birthday card of her life. Deed recorded. Remainder to C. Coyle, life estate reserved. She doesn't know yet. She has told this version of me that she sat at that table for a long time after reading it, and that what she felt wasn't grief exactly, though grief was certainly in the room with her. It was something closer to being caught, gently, by someone she hadn't realized was still holding on. She said it was the first time since I died that she cried without also feeling like she had to hold herself together for somebody else's sake. Because, for once, the crying wasn't about losing something. It was about understanding, all at once, exactly how carefully she'd been loved months before she ever knew there was anything to be grateful for. I want to be honest with you. If there's a single moment in this whole story I'd call the real ending, it isn't the conference room. It's that kitchen table. The conference room was where the plan worked. The kitchen table was where she understood why I'd made one. My funeral was 3 days later as scheduled, and by then the whole county had heard some version of what happened at that closing, because small counties do what small counties do. Dale came. He sat in the front pew beside Callie, and from what she's told me, he didn't say much through the whole service. Though at the graveside afterward, standing over the ground not far from where we'd scattered my own father decades before, he said one thing to her that I think was the truest sentence he'd spoken in over a year. "I would have sold it," he said. "I need you to know that I would have, and I don't fully know why that didn't bother me until right now." Callie didn't forgive him on the spot, because forgiveness isn't the kind of thing that arrives on schedule just because a grave is open in front of you. But she didn't walk away from him either. She told him the farm still had a place for him in it if he ever wanted to remember what that word had meant before he'd started pricing it. Brenda's ending was less generous, though I'll say plainly that she earned every bit of the difference. 9 days after the closing collapsed, the developer's representative, the same man behind the highest use conversation Brenda had been quietly nursing since that long ago Sunday dinner, called her directly instead of going through Dale. Callie was in the kitchen when it happened, because Brenda, rattled, had asked her to stay while she took it. The man was polite, which somehow made it worse. He told Brenda the firm had decided to pass on any future acreage in that stretch of the county, effective immediately, because a title defect discovered mid-closing wasn't the kind of story that stayed quiet in a business built on trust and quick paperwork. Brenda asked him if there was anything she could do to keep the conversation open. He told her, still polite, that the conversation had already closed itself the moment the word got around that the family had tried to sell a dying man's farm before he was in the ground. Brenda didn't say anything for a long moment after she hung up. Then she said, mostly to herself, this wasn't supposed to be the story people told. Callie didn't answer her, because there wasn't an answer that would have been kind. Brenda stopped coming to the farmhouse after that. I don't know that she was ever really coming for me in the first place, and I think by the end, even Dale had started to understand that too. I want to pause the story here for a moment, because I know some of you listening have wondered, somewhere in the last few minutes, whether any of this was actually legal, whether a dead man narrating his own revenge from beyond the grave has any business telling you it was all done properly, lawfully, without a single trick that wouldn't hold up in a courtroom. So, let me be plain with you, because Patricia was plain with me. And I think the whole reason this worked is that none of it depended on anyone being deceived. A life estate deed isn't a loophole. It's one of the oldest, most ordinary tools in property law, used every day by ordinary families trying to pass land down without dragging it through probate court. What made mine effective wasn't cleverness. It was simply that I recorded it, filed it with the county clerk, the way the law requires, the way my father had filed his deed 60 years before mine. Once a document is recorded like that, the law calls it constructive notice, which is a formal way of saying that anyone who bothers to check has no excuse for not knowing. Dale didn't have to be told about that deed by me. In a conversation over coffee, because the courthouse had already been telling anyone who asked for 6 months. He never asked. That was his mistake, not my deception. And I want you to notice something else, because I think it's easy to miss. Nobody broke a law to stop that sale. Diane Foster didn't do anything except her job, the ordinary, unglamorous work of a title search that every legitimate real estate closing is supposed to include. She wasn't hunting for a scandal. She was doing exactly what title companies exist to do, which is confirm that the person signing a deed actually owns what they're claiming to sell. The reveal in that conference room wasn't a trick sprung on my son. It was a routine check doing precisely what it's designed to do on a day when, for the first time in this whole story, somebody actually needed it to. The farm belongs to Callie now, free and clear, the way it's belonged to her, on paper, since that April afternoon. She finished her degree that spring, and instead of the job in the city she'd half planned on, she moved into the farmhouse full-time that summer. She kept the walnut trees. She replaced the tractor's hydraulic pump herself with her own money, the same repair Dale once wondered aloud whether I was even worth the investment of. She still writes in the ledger. I know this because Patricia told me before I died that she'd deliver it to Callie eventually, and Callie has apparently taken to adding an entry every planting season, same as every Coyle before her. And a few weeks after the funeral, she added one more line beneath mine, in her own hand, that Patricia read to me the only way anyone reads anything to the dead out loud, once, to no one. In an empty room, trusting it would land somewhere. It said, Grandpa left me more than land. He left me proof he was paying attention the whole time. I don't know if I've ever been prouder of anything I built in my whole life than that one sentence, and I built quite a lot of things over 77 years, fence lines, harvests, a marriage that lasted until cancer ended it, a son I raised with every ounce of care I had in me at the time. But that sentence, written by a hand I taught to hold a pen, is the one I'd choose to be remembered by if anyone ever asked me to pick just one. Dale visits now, most months, and he started asking Callie questions about the farm instead of about its market value, which I understand isn't the same as making up for lost time, but it's a start, and starts are usually all any of us get the chance to offer each other. Last spring, Callie told him he could plant a row of walnut saplings along the south fence, the one we restrung together in the mud that Saturday, if he wanted something out there that was his instead of just something he'd almost sold. He came out on a Sunday and planted 6 of them, alone, without asking anyone to help, and Callie said he stayed for dinner afterward and didn't check his phone once. I don't know what that means for the 2 of them in the long run. I only know it's more than I expected to get to see even from here. Brenda, as far as I know, doesn't visit at all. I've made my peace with that. Not every ending in a family gets to be a reconciliation. Some of them just get to be honest, which, in its own quieter way, is its own kind of justice. Here's what I've come to understand, from wherever it is I'm telling you this from. Legacy was never the 410 acres. It was never the walnut trees or the farmhouse or even the ledger itself, old and cracked as it is. Legacy is knowing, before you're gone, exactly who was paying attention while you were still here to be paid attention to, and making sure, in whatever quiet way is available to you, that the right person is standing there when the truth finally gets read out loud. I didn't need my son to understand that while I was alive. I only needed one lawyer, one deed, and one stranger with a folder to make sure it got understood after. If you were in my position, sick, quiet, watching people you loved start pricing out your life before you'd even finished living it, what would you have done? Would you have said something the moment you heard that toast? Or would you have done what I did and let the silence do the talking for you, one recorded page at a time? I'd be curious to hear it, however old you are, because I think the honest answer to that question says more about a person than almost anything else could. There's one more story I want to tell you, and it's not mine, though I think you'll understand why it's the next one I'd choose. A woman named Ruth, a retired court clerk 2 counties over from mine, picked up her phone one evening and heard a voice tell her that her own bank account had been hacked, that the only way to save her savings was to move every dollar of it immediately into what the caller called a safe account. Ruth didn't panic. She didn't even hang up. She did something almost nobody does when a stranger tells them their money is in danger. She asked him to send her his paperwork. And then, calm as anything, she started reading his own forged documents back to him, one line at a time, in a voice that made him realize, slowly, exactly who he'd actually called. That's next.